everyone, Kathy the Vegan Prepper here, and today we're going to discuss kind of the things that I think about to de-stress my process for stocking food. Let's get into it. Vegan prepper. Vegan prepper. The secret, basically, I think, to de-stressing this whole process is to simply focus on primarily stocking those things that have a shelf life of anywhere from 10 to 30 years. And that is essentially it. You don't necessarily have to stay for the whole video. My gosh, I'm terrible at this, but seriously, you don't. There it is right there, and then you can kind of run with it just in case you don't have time to watch the whole video. I want to make sure that you still get that. But there's a lot of things that are benefited by this focus, and so that's what I guess I'll discuss in the rest of the video for those of you who would like to stick around. By focusing on only items that have a really long shelf life, everything that you're stocking will last a really long time. It's like, whoa. I know I'm being basically Captain Obvious here for a second, but really, when you start getting into the nitty-gritty and all of the details surrounding food storage and like rotation and making sure that you're using stuff before it goes bad and all of that like mental bandwidth, you know, that can be kind of stressful especially for anybody who deals with things like ADHD or executive dysfunction, like certain people we're not necessarily going to name. It helps free up and just simplify and streamline the process. But if you're the kind of person who makes color-coded spreadsheets and is super organized in like every way in your life and you've never forgotten anything and you're just like super good at all that stuff, then you could possibly focus more on prepping by, you know, meal, for instance. Like I can get a year's worth of this meal together for my family or whatever. There's many ways of prepping, but that's just not how I do it. Here is one of my absolute favorite resources for the question of shelf life, but also how to store things to make sure the bugs aren't going to eat stuff and all of that stuff. Food storage for self-sufficiency and survival. I've talked about it many times on the channel. It's a fantastic resource. I will link it down below. I like that it's not a very large book. I read this entire book in just a couple days, got a ton of really good information. The bookmarked page I have here is the page that talks about the shelf life of foods. One of the amazing things too, when you think about it, and a lot of people will say, you know, how do you prep vegan? Or they assume that stocking and prepping is expensive. But honestly, if you prep in a more vegan or plant-based way, it's a lot cheaper. The vast majority of the foods, I mean, I don't know. I'm not like super handy with math to come up with a percentage, but out of this entire list, I think that there were maybe 2 or 3 things that were not vegan. And these are all the longest shelf life foods. That would be things like freeze-dried cheese, powdered milk, freeze-dried meats. Obviously, those are expensive, but the stuff like dry beans, lentils, rolled oats, pearl barley, white rice, like potato flakes, like so much stuff on the list that's vegan is actually some of the cheapest food that you can find. So that solves multiple things, multiple issues. It solves budget concerns, because we definitely have prepped on a major budget. We haven't like had, you know, we weren't just like rolling in cash when we started stocking up on our food. We were stocking from an extreme budget perspective. And I think honestly, stocking vegan is one of the easiest ways not only to stock your food long term, but to stock in such a way that you are staying true to a budget. Some of the most nutrient dense foods on this earth are beans. And like quinoa, for instance, that was my favorite. One of my favorite things I found out was that quinoa is a 20-year shelf life. And it's one of the few kind of whole grains that is oats too, or like a nutritional powerhouse. But if you do stuff like beans, quinoa, like if you can't have gluten, there's plenty of options. And so being able to stock those things. So for instance, for me personally, I made the switch, and I actually have a whole video where I discuss the merits of white rice versus brown rice versus quinoa, and I can link that video down below. It's a pretty old video, but I think it's still really good information. And so for me personally, I have switched over completely from brown rice and no longer put that away because brown rice has a much shorter shelf life. Let me find it for you guys really fast. It's only 3 to 5 years. So now that's not like, you know, that's not like no time whatsoever. It's not going to go bad tomorrow if you put it up, but it's not 20 years like quinoa is. Also, quinoa is much more nutritionally dense than brown rice is. Quinoa is in and of itself a complete protein. And so it's a fantastic thing to stock up on, but I've switched over completely basically from brown rice to quinoa as far as my storage goes, because of the fact that quinoa has a much longer shelf life, and it's also, in my opinion, for the most part, more nutritionally dense. And so that is kind of what I'm talking about when you look at certain foods, which ones store longer. It can inform what choices you make as far as what you're purchasing in bulk to put up in your food storage area for your family. And then over time, you end up basically with a large stock of food that's going to last several years before it goes bad. And it helps to remove some of the stress of, oh my gosh, I have so much food. I don't know, like how are you going to manage it to make sure that it stays good and all of that stuff. It frees up a lot of that mental, like that mental bandwidth, that stress. And then it helps you to just sort of relax, and you can just de-stress and be like, oh, all this food is just like, it's good for a really long time, and you don't really have to worry about it. And so yeah, I think it's just one of the best ways to focus on prepping. It's just in my opinion. They always say to eat what you store and store what you eat. And I think that that's really great. And I've talked about this a lot in other videos. I think in my first habits in prepping video, I talked about switching from canned beans to dried beans. There's many advantages to that. I can link that video down below. Not only does it save space, I think it's a lot cheaper in the long run. Obviously, the primary issue would be that you don't have pre-cooked things on hand, but I've done plenty of times. I've cooked over a fire. I've made beans using the combination of just like my firebox and the Wonder Bag. I have a video on that too. I can link down below. But I have kind of a different take on the store what you eat, eat what you store thing. And for us personally as a family, part of our prepping is bringing it into our daily lives and making sure that the foods that we're storing are the foods that we eat every day. And that means, that has meant, like I said with my example of switching from canned beans to dried beans, that has meant that we have changed the way that we eat in certain areas in our lives so that our stocking would be more beneficial and more efficient, or, you know, fit the idea of stocking only those things that last a really long time. Also potentially for me personally, like I know this is getting kind of off the subject, but like for instance, if we had to suddenly like leave or evacuate, we could bring our firebox, we could bring a pot, we could just basically load these buckets, and we have all these buckets full of beans and grains, and those could get loaded really fast into our car. We would have more food on hand than we would if it were in the canned form. Now, I know that there are pluses and minuses to everything. Again, I'm not trying to say that my way is the only way, even that my way is the best way. This is just the way that I have figured out for myself, because I do deal with anxiety and decision paralysis when it comes to things and they get too complicated. So I tend to boil stuff down and make it super simple. None of my stuff is fancy. None of my ideas are groundbreaking or revolutionary. It's just sort of getting down to the absolute most basic, simple thing. And for me personally, that's just storing the dry form of grains and beans. We've discussed too, I live in central Arizona. If I were to lose power, for instance, in the middle of summer, my house would climb into the high 90s very quickly. I would lose the security of seals on home canned goods. Potentially even store-bought canned goods might be compromised in the extreme level of heat that we could hit. And so that's another reason that for me personally, I focus a lot more just on the dried form of foods. Now, granted, high heat is not ideal for these foods either, but it's not like suddenly they're going to grow botulism just because like they got hot and they lost a seal and then maybe resealed when the temperature came back down. You know what I'm saying? So like there's a lot kind of that goes into my thought process on all of this stuff. And again, it's not necessarily that this is the only way for everyone. This is just the way that makes the most sense for me. And so if we focus on storing the things that last a really long time, and then also focus on making sure that our daily eating reflects what we're storing, and sometimes that means actually changing the way that we eat every day so that what we store becomes what we eat, then I think that that ends up being, you know, a really important kind of idea that I don't think a lot of people talk about. They like kind of talk about mainly storing only what you eat, like what you eat now, not necessarily in changing your eating habits to reflect what it is that you can most effectively store. And I think that it is possible to change eating habits, and if you're motivated, you can do it. And so that's a lot of what we have done. Again, we've switched to a lot of dry form of things just because not only is it cheaper, I feel like you can store more, and there's a lot of advantages to storing it that way. There's a lot of advantages to storing other ways as well. But that I think is just another thing to kind of keep in mind is, you know, maybe you could change some of your eating habits so that when you're storing your food, it's just more advantageous all around. As another thought, and I've mentioned before too, that these are not actually long-term storage buckets. These are all gamma sealed with gamma lids. These are ones we get into, you know, on a daily or weekly basis. Obviously, I'm not opening every single one of these buckets every single day, but at least a few of them are getting opened every single day because these are the buckets that we're digging into for our daily eating. I have now in storage for my long-term storage, what I have are the large bags of these items kind of ready to go and refill the bucket as needed. And so for instance, as soon as this is empty, my pinto beans are actually almost completely gone. I have another 25-pound bag of pinto beans that is currently in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber, because again, from that book, Food Storage for Self-Sufficiency and Survival, she discusses that the only thing it takes to kill potential bugs or bug eggs is an oxygen-free environment. And when you think about it, that really makes sense. So they have to be in an oxygen-free environment for at least 2 weeks, and that will kill bug eggs and bugs. I actually have a video on that as well, like talking about how you don't have to have a freezer in order to kill stuff. And it honestly kind of makes sense because pests overwinter. So it makes sense that freezing is not necessarily 100% effective against killing bug eggs, because if it were, in places that freeze in winter, you wouldn't have bugs anymore in the spring. So really the only way to truly guarantee that pests get killed is by putting them into an oxygen-free environment. And so that is what I do for the bags that are waiting to fill these buckets. And so I've always got all of these buckets, well, almost all of them, not all of them are going to get refilled. This is like, you know, little, but for the ones that I know for sure are going to get refilled, all of these buckets, the food that I'm going to put into them has already been through that process, so that when that goes into the bucket, that food is now free of bug eggs or any of that stuff. So even if they're sitting in the bucket for a year or more, like this pinto bean, I filled this in June of 2021. It is currently September of 2022. So obviously it's been longer than a year, but everything is still fine, right? Because buggies have been killed. None of that stuff is happening in these buckets because it's already been taken care of. And that's like another way of just sort of really just making it simple, getting everything set. And I don't have freezer space to do all of this, nor do I possess the organizational ability, that executive functioning ability to freeze and then say, okay, this is going to freeze for 2 weeks, and then I'm going to take it out, and then I'm going to freeze another thing for 2 weeks. And then like all of that stuff, like being super organized for this level, this many things, it's so much easier to just like throw stuff in a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber and then just forget about it, because it'll just be ready when I need it. And I think that is so much of this. Again, like you're storing really long-term stuff that's just basically ready when you need it, and then you don't have to think about it and you don't have to worry about it. So I will say definitely as the beans get a little older, they take longer to cook. That's a for sure thing, but I cook pretty much all of my beans in an Instant Pot, so it doesn't end up being that big of a deal. You just like either you do the upper end of the cooking level, or you just add a minute or two to the length of time that you would normally cook those beans, and then they're fine. If you were doing it just over the stove, then you would be cooking it for a little bit longer of a time. Anyway, you know, just like you do it that way. And so also have backup plans for potentially if you get to a level with your beans where they aren't cookable anymore. I don't know if that's a word, cookable. Then I have a grinder. Like I have both an electric grinder and a manual grinder. Both of them are equipped to grind beans. I can grind those beans up into a powder, and then once they are in, you know, bean flour form, you can cook with them. You can turn them into flatbreads. You can basically turn them into bean mush, and then they will cook in that form. So even that, I'm not overly concerned about the beans getting too old, because for one thing, it takes a long time for them to get too old to really cook. But even if they get too old to cook, I can always grind them, and I have a solution for that kind of in the back of my mind as well. Storing everything in the form that things last the longest, say for instance, wheat berries and all of that. I'm not spending a lot of my money on food that is expensive, right? Like we kind of already talked about that. I'm storing garbanzo beans and black beans. I'm storing wheat berries, which when I started, you could get a 50-pound bag of wheat berries for less than $30. Now, of course, it's much more expensive. But even still not prohibitively expensive. If you go to Azure Standard, a lot of their wheat is still in the $50 range for a 50-pound bag. That's not, you know, it's way more than it used to be, but it's not, you know, like a 50-pound bag of wheat is huge. But storing things in that way informed the way that I spent my money in other ways. And so the way that I choose to spend my money, for instance, was on things that would support the way that I was stocking kind of in a cheaper way, if that makes sense. And so I dropped a larger amount of money on a grinder or on the Wonder Bag or on, you know, my firebox, on the things that end up supporting my ability to cook these items, rather than spending all of my money on, you know, a freeze dryer or freeze-dried items. I'm just focusing on stuff that already stores for a really long time, and then making sure that all of my background preps are about making sure that I can utilize the things that I have stored. Hopefully I'm saying that all well. And because I do stock this way, and it's just very simplistic, these ingredients are super, you can make a huge variety of items from just some of the most simple ingredients, as long as you're stocking, for instance, spices, like stock whole spices. I have a whole video about spices being the variety of your food storage. I can link that down below as well. And that's where you can end up creating the variety if this seems like super plain and this is not something that you're really that interested in. Sorry about my chair creak. But that is where you can create all of your variety, and then you're able to, again, just sort of like, you don't have to think about it. Like it's like it's taken care of. You can kind of like move on with your life without overcomplicating everything. Another thing that I think is really great about this, and I talked about, not only is it like the cheapest way to stock, and you're stocking some of the cheapest foods that exist when you're doing it this way, but again, if you're doing the full picture, it's like the whole, it's a holistic picture of prepping. I think that not only are you stocking food that's really cheap, you have food on hand, and then when you're eating this way every day, when this is the food that you're eating every day, you're eating seriously one of the cheapest diets as possible to eat. People say that veganism is only for rich people, and that cracks me up, because actually the poorest of the poor across the world, for the most part, eat a plant-based style of diet. Now, they're not necessarily vegan, because, you know, if they have access to meat, they'll probably eat it. But like you have like in Africa, like huge sections of the population that are healthy on basically like sweet potatoes and just super simple food. The indigenous populations of the Americas, you know, before the colonies, like the colonial influence, you know, from Spain or Europe or whatever came over, you know, all the indigenous people a huge part of their diet was plant-based. They subsisted on like corn for the most part, and didn't eat tons of meat in their diet. These are people who are healthy and thriving, some of the poorest of the poor. As long as they're getting adequate calories, they're still nutritionally supported. And so this is not an expensive way to eat. The way that it gets expensive is if you start doing the vegan processed foods, like whatever, you know, fake burgers and fake cheeses and fake eggs and all of that. That stuff can get really expensive. But if you're focusing on whole plant foods, it's a very inexpensive way to eat, even still. The other thing that's really great, I think, about a lot of this is, especially kind of thinking again from a prepping standpoint, is that it's not food that is as desirable, because it's kind of, again, like some of those colonial kind of more European ideas that the superior food is meat. That's an idea that permeates our entire society, that the most superior food that you can have is meat or milk, you know, it's animal products. Like, as a general rule, society kind of poo-poos plants, you know, beans and things like that. People are so unused to eating beans that they have a lot of issues with eating them, you know, because their gut flora is not used to eating beans, things like that. So these things are not quite as desirable. And so if you focus your eyes on the stuff that not as many people are wanting, it ends up being a lot easier for you to stock food for your family, because these are things that the vast majority of people consider inferior. There is the question, of course, of things like B12 or vitamin D. What would you do for a prolonged disaster? And so the very short version of the answer that I've given many times is that I wouldn't expect that if I were in a prolonged disaster, I don't expect that I would be able to stay vegan. I would like to stay vegan for as long as possible, but at some point I would probably have to start eating animal products. That would probably end up being the only thing that I would have access to if I were still alive. Like in a true SHTF, without rule of law kind of situation, I honestly also don't really feel like I have a lot of chances. Most of my prepping is for, you know, like economic issues and things like that. I don't think, like, if there were a true disaster that I have a very, very big chance of still being here. But you can stock B12 supplements. A lot of them don't have a super long shelf life, but again, I don't think that is something that is necessary. I wouldn't plan on still being alive as a vegan, you know, 5 years after some big thing. That's kind of my thought on that whole process. Hopefully that was helpful and gave you some insights. I know that again, I don't know everything. I'm not trying to speak for every person's situation, but if any of that resonated with you or you enjoyed it, please let me know down in the comments below. Let me know too, for instance, if there's anything that you do to simplify or streamline your own prepping in your own situation. Maybe in your situation, this doesn't work, and so something else would work better for you. Let us know down in the comments below, because I know not everybody is in my situation. I mean, we're all different and we all have different ideas, and I think that that's great. And I think that it's all valid. So let me know down in the comments below. I always learn so much from all of you when you comment. You're so knowledgeable and just so rich in wisdom in this area, and I really truly love reading everything that you have to say down below. So anyway, yeah, I guess that's all. And as always, I hope the rest of your day is good and your life stays wonderful. As crazy as things get, you know what? It can still be wonderful. So anyway, focusing on that. And anyway, stay good out there. See you guys later.